Okay, let's dive into this explainer. I've been digging through some seriously fascinating and honestly pretty sobering source material lately. It presents this wild thesis. The modern corporate model of extraction, the way businesses harvest resources and turn a profit, well, it hasn't actually changed since the 1600s, not one bit. We're going to trace what the source calls the extraction carousel. It's essentially this identical model of commodity exploitation that just keeps spinning, going all the way from those early spice galleons straight through to the artificial intelligence algorithms we're all using today.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's start with something super familiar. Just picture your morning routine. You grab your go-to oat milk latte, maybe it's got a little sea salt or raw sugar sprinkle on top. It feels totally normal, right? Completely frictionless. But the source poses a pretty provocative question here. What is the true cost of that morning latte? Because, according to this analysis, you aren't just sipping coffee. You are drinking the result of 4 centuries of blood, soil, and corporate charters. That whole sense of frictionless convenience, it's actually built on a very specific, carefully engineered historical foundation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact historical through line we're going to be following. The source traces this identical corporate playbook across 4 whole centuries. I mean, think about it. Back in the 1600s, if you wanted to trade in nutmeg, black pepper, or tea, you didn't just go pitch a venture capital fund. No, you founded the Dutch VOC or the British East India Company. You hired literally thousands of mercenaries and essentially turned your corporate balance sheet into a sovereign nation with guns. And as you'll see, the source argues that this model, this weaponized, extractive corporation, is the direct ancestor to the modern tech stock tickers we see dominating the market right now.
The source highlights this really stark historical juxtaposition to show us how this works in practice. On one hand, you've got this refined image of elegant Victorian aristocrats sipping Earl Grey tea, pinkies raised, basically the ultimate picture of civilized domestic life. But then, beneath that veneer, you have the absolute reality that funded it. British gunboats bombarding Chinese ports during the Opium Wars. The text neutrally lays out how, when Imperial China refused British wool, Britain solved its massive trade deficit with weaponized opium, 2 wars, and a century of forced tea exports. It was elegance at home and brutal force abroad.
Which brings us to the foundational concept of this whole explainer. The source defines this as the extraction blueprint. Born out of those colonial tea trades, not to mention the enslaved labor and debt peonage used to extract sugarcane in the Caribbean and raw rubber in the Amazon, the formula was essentially set in stone. This corporate model is purposefully designed to do 3 very specific things: extract the raw wealth, externalize the agony and the cost onto someone else, and then serve the finished product hot and ready to the consumer. It's a formula we are going to see repeating itself perfectly as we keep moving forward.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this centuries-old blueprint applies to modern agriculture. Fast forward past the muskets and galleons, and you meet the ABCD giants: Archer Daniels Mill, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. These 4 massive agricultural cartels quietly control up to 90% of the global grain, soy, and cocoa trade. That is huge. The source notes they operate on something called the crush margin. Basically, this means they squeeze their massive profits from the spread between bankrupt, struggling farmers at harvest time and the highly profitable processed food empires waiting for us in the grocery store aisles.
And just like that tea in the 1800s, our modern grocery store indulgences hide some very real, completely unpriced casualties. The source gives us these visceral examples to really ground this economic blueprint. Take cashews, for instance. They come encased in toxic anacardic acid that can literally melt the skin of the workers deshelling them in India. Or cocoa, where Wall Street prices fluctuate wildly while farmers in West Africa earn sub-poverty wages, often relying on child labor. Hazelnuts heavily depend on exploitative migrant family labor in Turkey. Even salt carries this heavy legacy, stretching all the way from the British salt taxes that sparked Gandhi's march to modern toxic industrial brine dumping today.
Okay, let's move to and see how this builds when the extraction model jumps from controlling the land to controlling biology itself. Back in the late 1990s, the source explains, the biotechnology giant Monsanto entered India. Traditionally, Indian farmers had used these regenerative, native cotton seeds. They were totally free to save and naturally resilient to the local environment. But then, Monsanto introduced genetically modified Bt cotton. These hybrid seeds promised an absolute miracle. But there was a catch. They were high-cost, strictly non-reusable, and heavily protected by corporate patents.
But as the source points out, that promised miracle completely failed. They describe this as the biotech trap. See, the genetically modified seeds were supposed to wipe out the destructive pink bollworm. Instead, the pest simply adapted and came back even stronger as super bollworms. And because the farmers couldn't legally or physically save their seeds, they were forced to buy proprietary hybrid seeds every single year at massive markups. Add in the expensive chemical pesticide cocktails just to fight off the new pests, and it was a recipe for disaster. When monsoons failed, it created a devastating debt cycle. Hundreds of thousands of Indian farmers lost their livelihoods and ultimately their lands to this biotech monopoly.
So the carousel spins again to the next iteration of the extraction blueprint. The source asks a pretty dark question. Why settle for owning seeds when a corporation can own human biology? Enter DuPont and the engineering of PFAS in the mid-20th century. These are those supposedly indestructible carbon-fluorine miracle coatings that gave us non-stick Teflon cookware and super effective water-resistant sprays. From a consumer perspective, hey, it was a frictionless kitchen miracle. But chemically, it was a bond designed to never, ever break down in nature.
So the crucial point is this absolutely staggering number right here, 99%. The source reports that even though DuPont executives allegedly knew about the severe health risks of chemical runoff for decades, the profits just kept rolling on. The consequence of that? Today, those non-stick forever chemicals reside in roughly 99% of all human blood on Earth. The explainer makes a really chilling point here. You didn't just buy a frying pan, you effectively bought a permanent chemical lease inside your own body. The agony was completely externalized, right into our bloodstreams.
Which brings us all the way to the present day, and our very latest corporate miracle, artificial intelligence. The marketing around AI presents it to us as the ultimate clean, weightless future. You know, it's billed as this pristine, ethereal math, living effortlessly in something we conveniently just call the cloud. It is purposefully designed to feel completely detached from the messy, physical world of soil, sweat, and extraction that we've been looking at so far.
But if you actually look under the hood of your favorite chatbot, the source argues that AI uses the exact same extractive playbook as those spice galleons. First up, mineral extraction. The cloud requires physical servers powered by artisanal cobalt miners in the DRC digging ore by hand and cooled by literally millions of gallons of precious desert groundwater. Second, invisible labor. To make the AI seem perfectly safe for us, thousands of outsourced click workers in Nairobi are paid pennies an hour to filter through explicit psychological trauma. And finally, cultural enclosure, the wholesale scraping of the world's open art, literature, and code without consent, effectively locking human history behind corporate API paywalls.
All of this analysis culminates in this incredibly powerful overarching thought from our source material. The wrapper changes, but the engine of extraction never stopped running. Whether it's armed British East India galleons, ADM grain silos controlling the global food supply, Monsanto seed patents trapping farmers in endless debt, DuPont forever chemicals permanently leased into our blood, or the multi-gigawatt AI clusters scraping our collective culture, the core mechanism is absolutely identical.
And that brings us to the final, provocative thought this explainer leaves us with. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. In a world where literally every convenience, from your morning latte right down to your AI assistant, is built on an unbroken 400-year loop of externalized cost, you really have to ask yourself, are you an aware buyer, or are you just another subscriber, happily seasoning your own extraction? It's a heavy question for sure, but an incredibly important one to ponder. Thanks for joining me to unpack this fascinating material, and keep questioning the systems around you.